Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Sober Stew podcast. You are watching and listening to an addiction recovery podcast. Today, I've got a guest on that I believe has been really supportive of the podcast launch since I went on Instagram about 2 months ago. There's been a lot of support, but Janice Johnson Dowd, I believe, has been one of our biggest supporters. So welcome, Janice. Thank you for joining the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here and part of your first season because I predict there'll be very many more seasons.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you. And do you know what? Hopefully there will be. And I've been excited about having you on as well because, when I speak to guests and we get a little fact find form come through, I don't do a lot of research, but I've read what you had to say. And do you know what? I was reading your website actually this morning, and it made me feel a bit emotional. So, and I like that in recovery because it's real, and
Mhm.
it shows our growth as well. So, you know, I know we don't want to talk about a big drinkalog, and I respect that because I'm that kind of person as well. But I do want to know a bit about your background, and I
Mhm.
want you to share that with the viewers, if possible, please.
Absolutely. Well, I'm kind of a late in life alcoholic because I grew up in an alcoholic home. And early on, I decided I was never going to become an alcoholic and I would never put my kids through what I felt like my brothers and I had experienced. I experimented with alcohol and drugs as a kid, but honestly, I didn't like the effect they had on me. I was already very much or had the characteristics of an adult child of an alcoholic, very controlling, very uptight, anxious. So when I drank alcohol, it didn't make me feel relaxed. It made me feel out of control. And when I smoked pot, I pretty much just got paranoid and anxious. So I did drink and smoke pot throughout high school and a little into college, but only really out of peer pressure and to fit in, to help with social anxiety, some of those common things. My, my, I don't know how people will feel about this, but I was an athlete in high school and college, and even the first few years after college, I participated in triathlons and biathlons and 10Ks and all of that. And honestly, I look at that as my addiction. It was a socially acceptable addiction, but I approached it the same way that I did with alcohol later in life. It was my way of escaping, a way of self soothing, getting out my frustration. And also, it was good for my self esteem because I was somewhat successful at it. And yeah, so I think I've always been an addict. It's just that for the first 30 or so years, it was a socially acceptable addiction.
Janice, what's
Go
your
ahead.
view? Sorry, what's your view? Do you believe that you was born an addict?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Both of my parents,
Yeah,
my
yeah,
mother's
yeah.
father was an alcoholic, as they would say in her family, that terrible kind, that you had to go pick him up from the bar. So my mom had all the
Mhm.
traits of an adult child of an alcoholic. She didn't drink much growing up. My dad was absolutely a functional alcoholic. And as a kid, I didn't realize it so much because he was like every other dad, you know, who'd come home, go straight to the bar, get a drink, and sip on drinks all the rest of the evening. He wasn't a stumbling, angry drunk. He was just numbing himself out, which is what I became for the most part too. But in his family, there were alcoholics back in the line too. So I really do buy into the disease concept and into the genetic concept. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, 100%. I'm in agreement. I feel that it's a disease that you're born with. That's my perception on it. Because of that, when I was a child, there was that irritability, discontented,
Mhm.
restlessness, that not fitting in feeling, which I hear a lot of addicts, describe that's how they felt. And that was before I picked up a drink or any kind of other mind altering substance. So, you know, when I did pick up, that gave me that sense of that ease, that feeling of
Mhm.
that little bit more a contented feeling for a short period of time, not for a long period of time. And I liked it. It allowed me to be this person that I wanted to be, not this shy little boy who was scared of his shadow. It gave me some bravado, it gave me some personality. I think that's what I was probably lacking in. I thought I was lacking in his personality. So, do I believe it's an illness that you're born with? Yeah, I do, 100%.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have 4 kids. I very often remind them that, they could carry the gene. And I know you have at least 1 child. Are you concerned about any of your children or
Yeah, I have
extended family
three.
members? Okay.
It's a hard one. I don't think there's a concern for me. I'm a bit like this in life now. What will be will be. I talk
Mhm.
about my addictions openly and honestly with my children. Even my 3.5, nearly 4 year old. I just celebrated my sobriety birthday, for the first time, I'm telling her what that means. And she bought me presents, and she was really proud to have that day with me, which was beautiful. So the concern's not there, I suppose, because the journey, maybe my higher power's got a plan and their higher power's got a plan, and what will be will be. But as long as I
Mhm.
can support them in anything that may or may not happen, that's where my concern will be. I just need to be the best version of me.
Yeah, I totally agree with that too. And when at times, and this is also one of the messages in my book, is that at times I feel really bad about putting my kids through what I went through, and I can get wrapped up in guilt and shame. But what my sponsor and therapist have pounded into my brain is that, at least I'm demonstrating that you can come back, you can recover from that. And my addiction at the end was pretty ugly, you know? So they saw the ugliest part, and now they see me here and actually are really proud of me and the book and my efforts to, promote it.
Yeah.
So,
What was your rock bottom?
okay.
How did it get to the end? And then what was the trajectory into your sober life?
Right, that's great. Okay, so I started drinking, like, we drank socially, I would say from my, teens to 40, but didn't have alcohol in the house, didn't do any drugs. I always it again, I had other socially acceptable addictions, fitness and running and parenting. But, so I started drinking in my 40s, and I was part of that, like, mommy wine culture. Couple glasses of wine at lunch, watching The Bachelor, we'd have a couple of glasses of wine. The problem is that I would keep drinking into the night, whereas my friends would stop. And so sometime in my 40s, it went from social drinking to alcoholism, and I can't really say exactly when, but, at the end, I know it was ugly, and I was because my professional background is let me back up for just a minute. So, coming from that dysfunctional family, of course, I was drawn to the helping field, and I became a social worker and worked in addiction facilities. So, I worked as the
Oh,
family
wow.
therapist or as the counselor to the teens, um, which really fueled my shame and guilt in my 40s when it became apparent, when I could no longer deny that I was an alcoholic. So I'd worked in this field, but prior to getting sober, I tried everything else I could, like antidepressants, anti-anxieties, sleeping medication, counseling again, and, it didn't help. So finally I started going to AA.
Nothing worked.
My bottom was, okay, so I'd like to think most of the world's heard about Mardi Gras. Mardi Gras is very big in the South here. And in Mobile, Alabama, we like to say that we brought Mardi Gras to the US before New Orleans. So I started going to AA in November and would get a few days here and there a week. I'd go back and pick up silver chips. I'd start over again. And, but I thought when Mardi Gras came up, I had some family coming into town. I was like, well, I've been managing, so I'll allow myself Mardi Gras, and I'll pick up a new
Yeah.
chip on, Ash Wednesday. But it's just like the disease, when you stop, you pick right back up. So in that week's
Yeah.
time, I became, an embarrassing drunk driving, took out my neighbor's mailbox, fool. And my best friend
Okay.
and my family, my extended family, confronted me and said, "You got to go to treatment. You say you've been going to AA and it's not working."
Janice, so was AA not working, or was you not working AA? What was the deal there, do you think?
No, that's absolutely it. I was not working. I was working AA my
Oh,
way. You know, I
okay.
especially the part where you can start again. Come on, you're always welcome back, which I still welcome back anyone who relapses and comes into the rooms. I
Yeah.
focus on the present and the positive. But I use that. I was like, eh. And I had a sponsor. I read the steps, but I wasn't working the steps. I was going to meetings. I went to meetings almost every day, but I still come home and drink and
Okay.
lie about it the next meeting. And yeah, I just didn't work the program. I believe in the program. It is a big part of my recovery.
So the question is, do you think that, from your experience, that trying to put the drink down, but the mind wasn't changing, the thought processes wasn't changing? Do you see that having a psychic change and changing the way you think as a person is key to a good life in recovery?
Yeah, absolutely. And some people are blessed with a sudden psychic change. For me, no. For me,
Yeah.
I just had to work the program, do the therapy, and gradually the change came. And I can look back and go, I am a vastly different person. Thank God. Um, but there was no
Mm.
big bang. So, and really,
No.
w- I really had a terrible second bottom in sobriety, um, that I
Okay.
would say was as painful as the first, and is what motivated me to actually start working on my issues with my family. So, did you experience like
Okay.
resistance from your family when you first got sober?
When I first got sober, do you know what I feel like? It was a bit of a daze. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had hope. I think was the first thing that was in my mind. Um, I don't know if anyone believed that I was going to do it. That is what perception I think I was being given. And I remember having these chats with my sponsor, and I was ringing up my son who I hadn't seen for some time. I was ringing up his mum and telling her, sorry, that I hadn't had a drink for a period of time. And he said to me, "Stop doing that." He said, "Your actions have got to speak louder than your words. You've lied and talked absolute rubbish for years. Just
Mhm,
keep doing what you're doing." He said, "Don't worry about anyone else. The rest will follow as long as you're doing the right thing." So I think there probably was a little bit of resistance, but rightly so in some respects, because people were
mhm,
skeptical of whether I was being whether I was being honest, because I was a born liar, born
mhm.
manipulator. That's just who I was.
Yeah, I can relate to that too. And I w so when I but I was very naive. Even though I'd had that professional experience, I was still naive going into treatment. I had the idea that getting sober was gonna be all I had to do. Getting sober, say I'm sorry. I figured I'd go to 4 weeks of treatment. I'd come home, we'd do some family therapy, and everything would be great. And that's where I started making my first mistakes, in that I minimized the damage I had done to my family members, and I was in denial about their hurt and pain and what it was gonna take to repair that.
What damage do you think that you done? What was it? How did you get that second rock bottom? What happened?
Okay, so great question. Well, my second rock bottom, the short version of the story is 4 weeks of treatment evolved into 12 weeks because I had a lot of unresolved childhood and young adult issues, PTSD, some sexual trauma, things like that. And then,
Okay.
while I was doing work on myself, my treatment center was about 200 miles away from my home. And my kids at that time ranged in age from like 13 to 21, all involved in sports and activities. So they didn't get much of an opportunity to come up and see me. My short answer is becoming a long answer. Sorry. So we didn't have very
No, it's cool.
much.
It's cool. It's cool.
Okay, yeah, we didn't interact very much. And when they did come up and see me, I just made a mess of that because I regressed back to the people pleasing little girl from my ACA family who wanted to make everyone happy and thought that if I just ignored the problems or brushed them under the rug, that they'd get over it, you know? So I made that mistake. And end of my like 10, 12 weeks, the treatment center and I both agreed that going home would be a big trigger for me. It was going to be hard for me to stay sober. So I went to a treatment center, and that's where I continued to make mistakes. So if you think about it this way, I created a divide in my family by being alcoholic and embarrassing them, taking my guilt, frustration, and anger out because they were really the brunt of they received the brunt of the pain because I mainly drank at home at night.
Yeah.
So there was an initial divide. Then there was a physical divide, which was difficult to overcome. And then I went to a halfway house for 3 months. And at the halfway house,
Okay.
I embraced the woman there almost like a new family. I I mean, my kids are my number one reason for getting and staying sober and for this book and for wanting to help other people. Um, but for the first 3 months at that halfway house, I still didn't do anything of meaning to repair the relationships with my kids. I didn't go visit them. I didn't encourage them to visit me. I sent superficial letters. I didn't make phone calls. I just avoided, dismissed, denied our family problems. I got very selfish in early recovery, which, I also have said this before. In some ways, I use the principles of the program to enable that. And that, because I still believe this fully. I've got to work on my recovery. I can't repair my relationships with my family if I'm not sober. So I'd be like,
No.
I got to do this. I got to invest everything into my family. And then the second crisis came when I got kicked out of the halfway house at almost 6 months sober. Yeah. And that's a whole story in itself. But let's just say I got kicked out of the halfway house and lost my second family. And at that time, I realized I'd lost my first family because the woman at the halfway house were no longer allowed to speak to me because I was a bad influence. I lost that family. And so I hit a bottom. That was my like ACA or sobriety bottom where I slipped into a deep, dark depression. I was still going to meetings. Thank God for my sponsor, my old temporary sponsor. Um, I but I slipped into a very dark depression. I listened to your podcast that was posted yesterday where you talked about depression and suicide, and I hope this is not a trigger. But for about 2 months, I was suicidal. So it was an ACA bottom. I stayed sober because of working a really good program. But I emotionally fell apart, you know? And and I hope that you'll do a podcast on, the risk of early suicide. I mean, of suicide and early recovery because
Yep.
I've seen it happen so many times.
Valid point. Valid point. I feel like a podcast on that subject is needed. 100%.
Absolutely. I think because we've removed our primary coping mechanism of alcohol, drugs, or an addictive behavior, but our problems are not removed, and in fact sometimes are increased. Like I increased the problems with my family, and then not having the alcohol to fall back on, I had no way to numb it. So I slipped into depression and okay, so I'm sober 10 years. You're sober 19, right? I can't count the number of people I know who've committed suicide in early recovery. So, and I think relapse and early recovery is primarily that reason too. That's why you got to continue to do the work and build other kaboom mechanisms.
I was going to ask you, what do you think the reason is that early in recovery, many people take their own lives? What do you think the fundamental reason is?
I think the fundamental reason is that you are now faced with all your problems. It's a bit overwhelming.
Hmm.
You don't have, it can look really bad. And for someone like me, I had lost everyone in my life, my family of origin, my second family. I had my sponsor, thank God, and just felt really alone and like I couldn't understand. And I think this is true for other people too. How I'm working the program so hard. I'm like the model sponsee, but my life is still falling apart. I'm still
Yeah.
experiencing great pain.
Do you think? Do you think a prime example here is that if you look back, do you believe that even though you're working the program so hard, had you forgiven yourself?
Oh, that's a great point. No, I hadn't.
Mm. And I'm looking at that as we're talking, and I'm thinking, look, and I'm looking at my note about the risks of suicide and early recovery, and maybe that is one of the reasons as well. Is that because I said this to a friend of mine the other day? When you're working your step 8, step 9, you're making your amends. You have to be on the top of that. You've got to make amends to
Mhm.
yourself. You've got to forgive yourself. Because it's all
Mhm.
well and good flying out the door, making amends to X, Y, and Z, and everyone else, but if you're not fixing that hole in the soul by making amends to yourself, you're in a problem situation. I think the one that you're going to struggle getting out of.
You're absolutely right. I think I had an aha moment today. Thank you for that.
Ah,
Yeah.
you're more than welcome. You're more than welcome. No, all I was going to say to you was that that feeling that you had after 6 months. That is a despair feeling, isn't it? That is like you don't know which way to go. Yeah, so you do have thoughts, and I can imagine what thoughts you had, as you just said. What give you that spur on to build this, like you've got a relationship with your family and your children now? What happened then to get you on
Mhm.
that track?
Well, that you know what? I think God um intervened in a good part. I didn't normally share this, but I had a couple of ideas of ways that I could kill myself where it would look more accidental. I think God gave me a little taste of that, and I was like, "Oh." Like, one of the things was, well, I'm a big hiker. I can go hiking and fall off a cliff. So one day, I'm at this, like, NA conference in the mountains, and, I'm like, "This is perfect. There's cliffs everywhere," and I'm walking down this path, and unfortunately, I run into a lot of people, so that kinda ruled it out, and then I see this sign that says, "Beware of bears," and had to do, and I was like, "Oh my god, I don't wanna be attacked by a bear," which the light bulb went off and went, "Wait, that's the perfect way to die," and I was like, "Maybe I don't wanna die." So, a couple little things like
Hmm.
that happened, and then, I finally began to start to really share to my therapist and my sponsor how depressed I was. And so
Okay.
2 main routes. One with my therapist, I started addressing my ACA traits and looking at how they impacted my relationships with my family, like being superficial, being a people pleaser, telling people what they wanted to hear, and seeing how those traits don't work in early recovery with your family and repairing family because they want to see
Yeah.
action, like you said earlier. They don't want to hear it. They want to see things. And my
No.
family couldn't see it because I wasn't around them. And then the other thing I did, kind of put my social work hat back on and was like, okay, I'm gonna I'm gonna study this. And so, and my sponsor was
Mm.
great. She's like, so every like discussion meeting that she led, she'd be like, okay, our topic today is going to be repairing relationships with your family. Want to hear everyone's experience, strength, and hope, what they did, what worked, and gradually that just built up. And in my personal research, I looked at all the books, read all the books, already had a bunch of them in my, personal library, but there wasn't literature based on or directed at the addict or alcoholic or recovering individual on how to repair their relationships, what works, what doesn't work, what makes family therapy different when there's an addiction versus family therapy for issues over communication, infidelity, things like that. And so that's kind of how my book evolved. And my sponsor, love you to death, Tippy. She is a retired teacher. And so she'd give me homework and assignments and made me a binder. And the book just evolved naturally. And
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, so I started making small changes with my family, started making efforts. And it still took well over another year before I could see a significant improvement in my relationships with any of my kids. And which
Okay.
my message of hope is that it can happen, you know, no
Yeah.
matter how bad your relationship is, you can still improve it or put closure on it. So I'm rambling now.
No, you're not. You're not rambling, Janice. And do you know what? I feel like I was reading between the lines as well. Then what you were saying, and it seemed like that you eventually got honest. Was that one of the big things for you as well when you started talking to your therapist, and maybe with your family as well, and with yourself actually in thinking about that? That's a big one, isn't it? Honesty.
Yes, absolutely. And that's, you have to be honest and willing to experience the pushback that you get from your family members.
Some might say that you went to any lengths to get sober. When you went into a treatment center, then you went into the halfway house and you was there for that period of time. And I would say that it sounds like from the outside that you was going to any lengths, and maybe you wasn't thinking about the damage it was causing elsewhere, but you must have wanted recovery to put yourself in them situations. You must have wanted it. You tell me otherwise.
Absolutely. No, no, absolutely. I mean, I think I was like a lot of people, not most people, but like when I first started going to AA meetings, at first I was like, oh, I'm not as bad as I haven't done this much damage. And then when I first
Hmm.
got into treatment and I, was beginning the real surrender, I still tended to minimize the damage I had done. And again,
Yeah.
I think that was a coping mechanism that I picked up from my family growing up. But at some point, I remember I was like 10 days in, and they're like, we think you should go to the longer program. We think you should be here for 8 weeks. At first, I resisted. And, um, and then there was another God moment. And this is a pretty big facility, a
Okay.
facility that I love and respect. Every night there'd be a speaker meeting at the facility. And at one of the speaker meetings, this woman came up from behind me and goes, Janice, how are you? I wanted you to know I was here. It was one of my neighbors. One of my neighbors who I had a lot of respect
Oh,
for was a nurse, had no idea that she had a problem with alcohol. And she was in that
wow.
longer program. She was in a 6-week program. So I was like, oh, maybe I should talk to her. So that was a God thing. It's like God, because we were in separate buildings, separate programs. She just happened to see me at lunch or something one day and she reached out. And that's when I started to really surrender. I mean, I started to say, okay, there's too many signs pointing me this way. I am just going to give in. And also, I started to see some relief in sharing, that carrying the burden of secrets of like sexual abuse is hard. And, the program is definitely about, you know, stopping, breaking secrets, telling your truth. And I started getting pieces of real relief and seeing that my issues were much deeper than I wanted to admit.
That's
So,
powerful.
yeah, I just kept giving in when from that point on, I was like, all right, you know, I'll do it. Whatever. If you're smarter than me, here I was a social worker working in this field, and I still ended up an alcoholic making a mess of my family. You got to know something more than I. And
Yeah.
that's why I think sponsorship is so important, because it gives you the opportunity to have someone else give you an objective feedback. So,
Yes. Definitely. Definitely. Can I ask you a question about treatment centres in the States? Because
mhm.
I think it works completely different to how it would work over here in the UK. And I speak to people online, and I read quite a lot that many people have been through treatment, and I'm like, wow, that as much as it's available here in the UK, it's not used in the same amount of quantity with people as it is in the States. How does it work back home with you guys? How does it work?
Well, there's a variety of different types of treatment settings. The facility I went to had both an inpatient and an intensive outpatient program. Um, but I think, and I could be wrong, someone could be hearing this because it was 10 years ago that I was in treatment. And I've done some speaking at treatment centers and stuff, but I haven't really dug into if the protocols changed. Um, but typical inpatient treatment or intensive outpatient treatment is like 4 weeks, and getting to like the first 3 steps, like starting a foundation
Okay.
of recovery skills. And in 4 weeks' time, you can't really deal with some of the deeper issues if you got them. Um, and then most facilities will offer an ongoing aftercare program. Mine did, like a once a week or twice a month program that gives you an opportunity to continue to address some of those deeper issues. Because, like AA, this
Right.
is why, and you said yesterday that you still do counseling. I still do counseling too. I'm involved in
Mhm.
a women's therapy group, because in AA, you can't crosstalk. You can't
Mm.
reach out to another person the way you can in group therapy. You can't reflect back on if you see something or hear something that's going on with them that either you can relate to or that you can give them some feedback about. So, oh man, just jumped
Yeah.
from. So, treatment in America, I think, is there's a lot of good opportunities. I think Obamacare made it more accessible. Unfortunately, the major population in treatment centers and inpatient are kids under 26 who are still on their parents' insurance, and people like me over, you know, adult who have good insurance. So, yeah, uh, we could talk a lot about improvements that could be made in treatment facilities, but and the treatment focus is definitely on the patient. Here's where I think a failing is. So, 30 years ago when I worked in treatment facilities, worked at a couple of great ones, and we had an amazing family program which involved the patient. And like at the facility I went to, the patient was not involved at all in the family program. There was very limited family therapy or counseling. And I'd like to see that
Right.
improved.
Okay.
But
That's not great then, is it?
no, but
Yeah.
I can't speak to all
Because
treatment
as you
centers.
know, and well, I was going to say, addiction is a family illness, isn't it? So
Hmm.
if you're only treating the addict and you're not treating the family that's immediately with the addict, you're kind of missing a big chunk, aren't you?
Right. And family support, I think, is so crucial. You know,
Yeah.
because again, 30 years ago I found this, and recently I found this, and kind of mentioned it earlier that, we're making all these changes within ourselves. Our families are not trusting of us yet. they may see these new behaviors as just more crazy, erratic behaviors. I mean, I've had many people say to me when I was working as a social worker, I kind of liked them better when they were drinking because I knew that they would, especially if they drank at home, they would be numbed out and not involved in making decisions. In fact, I was at a meeting a couple of days ago, and a gentleman was talking about how his wife finally said to him, you're getting on my nerves because you're around so much now, and I'm not crazy about it. So, I mean, so the family needs to be involved in the sense that they need to be empathetic to our situation, the changes that we're making, and we need to know more about how our family members have been affected. Like, there's not a whole lot of information for the addict in a treatment center about the family disease model, except for to address it book style.
Right. So there's a lot of room for improvement then.
I think so. But I may ruffle
Yeah.
a few feathers that way by saying that. I think
Well,
there's always room for improvement, and each case is different, Um,
Hmm.
and I made mistakes that many other people won't make, you know, and my family situation could be vastly different from the next person's. So in my book, I address a whole lot of basic, easy to understand skills and tools, as well as some insight into family disease model, the brain,
Okay.
broken brain syndrome, all of that.
Right. Well, do you know what, James? Before we go on to your books, I do want to in a minute. I'd like to know, because I do really want to know actually, what your relationship is like now with your four children. I really want to know. Do you know what I mean? I've got a background in my head now. I want to picture it in my mind.
Okay, it's fabulous. It is really fabulous. I'm
Okay.
probably still a little codependent on them because, like, my daughter is now one of my best friends, and
Right.
in fact, she's going to do a couple of podcasts with me later next year because she wants to be able to chime in when I talk about those early days to give her opinion about
Mhm.
what it was like from the family's point of view, and the mistakes I made.
Okay.
Uh, but okay, so it took my middle son. I have 3 boys and a daughter, and they're about 8 years apart. My middle son, who took the most active part in treatment, was the quickest to begin to trust me. That was still at about a year and a half sobriety. Um, I'd
Okay.
like to think it was because he was the most active in treatment, but it might have just been his nature, my nature, who knows? The
Who knows?
youngest child, it took well into 4 years before I could say that I saw a significant improvement in that relationship.
Okay.
There's lots of factors in all of that too, because I got divorced during that time period, and those things impacted the relationship. I think early on there was
Yep.
probably because of those wounds that I did early on that made them harder to heal. Took a little longer.
Yeah.
But that's why I'm so passionate about this topic, is because it didn't have to be that way. If I would have even taken a few extra steps while I was in treatment, I wouldn't have created all that
Yeah.
damage I did in that next 3 months at the halfway house. So, anyhow, my kids are my favorite travel companions. I've seen all 4 of them now graduate high school and college. I've one child who's still in grad school, and the greatest thing is that they're proud of me. And okay, I'm going to share this.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
this is a story. You may want to edit it out. But a big part of one of the treatment tools that they did at my facility was the family members got to write an impact letter to you. So my middle son wrote an impact letter, and a couple other family members wrote impact letters. And it was brutal,
Mm.
painful. But again, I think that's part of the reason why, he was able to get some of that stuff off his chest. I had to read it in front of my whole group therapy.
Yeah,
It was brutal. Everyone was in tears.
brutal.
But so none of the other kids wrote letters, which is fine. But I had my 10-year birthday in February 14th of this year. And my kids wrote me, and I keep
Lovely.
this with me everywhere. It's probably backwards. Impact letters about
Okay. Yeah.
how my sobriety has impacted them. I mean, it gives me chill bumps just, to talk about it. They had a little surprise party for me. It was amazing and a real testimony to, that this works, that families can
Yeah,
heal.
yeah.
Yeah. So my relationships
Listen,
are great.
Janice, you said to me about editing that story. I'm not editing that story out. There is no way that would be edited out because that is one of the priceless gifts of sobriety. How beautiful is that? How
Hmm.
beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can't buy that.
Yeah. I'm really blessed. And I'm blessed that my kids are healthy and happy, and that I think they
Yeah.
come to me with their problems. You know what I mean? They may, like I said, I'm a little codependent. If I have a vacation or time off, I'd much rather spend it with one of them than a girlfriend, which is maybe not as
Hmm.
healthy as it could be, but it works.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't see how it's doing any damage. And do you know
Right.
what? I suppose one of the things that we learn in recovery is that we're going to be the best version of us, and we're going to be the mother or the father or whoever we are that we wasn't before. So maybe what
Hmm.
you're doing is healthy. Maybe you're just continuing building what you're on the foundations that you've already laid.
It's only going to get better. So,
As long as you're happy. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And they're happy.
I
I
want to know about your
mean,
book,
oh,
Dennis. Talk to me about this book. How did it start? Well, you told me.
well, yeah, it started because out of the need, it just evolved naturally. I'm looking to see if I have notes, easy access notes. But and because I've always been like a researcher and writer, even in undergraduate and graduate school, I worked as teaching assistant. I worked as a research assistant for two different professors, helping them write
Okay.
their thesis. So it's kind of natural. I love writing. I love journaling. I think journaling is a great resource for, at least for me, for helping sort out my feelings when I'm getting crazy and I can't talk to someone. And it evolved initially too because my home group well, I got sober in the town of Birmingham and lived there for a couple of years, the first couple of years of my sobriety. So I have a home group in Birmingham, Alabama, and a home group in Daphne, Alabama. And my home group in Birmingham goes to the local treatment center and does, kind of a short version of a topic meeting. So every chance I got, I'd be like, okay, the topic today is going to be repairing relationships with your families. Yeah, I got lots of really positive feedback and from the therapist and stuff there. So, um, yeah, it evolved naturally. And like I said, there's just not a lot of information out there in reference to it. Now, the book is
Yeah.
not published yet, uh, but
Okay.
I have an agent and a acquisition editor who is going to, maybe
Wow.
by the time this podcast is published, I will know for sure that this publishing company is going to take it on. But if not, my agent and
Fantastic.
I will self publish. So eventually it'll come out. But
Yeah, yeah.
so the book is
Yeah.
designed kind of like treatment in the fact that it starts off kind of harsh, like, okay, the introductory chapter is a lot of my story. Um, and setting the stage for this is going to be a hard process. Get ready, and then the next chapter is, and this makes me a little nervous because the whole disease concept and the broken brain syndrome, that information is changing so much, but I address that at some depth, at a very, this is an oxymoron, a superficial depth, a depth where you can understand it and grasp the concept, but not in terms of the difference. I mean, I talk about dopamine and all of that, but not to any scientific depth. And I think that chapter is important because for two reasons. It softens the blow from the first chapter, which is harsh and in your face. And its goal is to help remove the guilt and shame. You've got a disease. You've got a disease and you're probably predestined to get this. So some of your behaviors and actions are inherently related to your disease. So that's part of it. And then the other part with that chapter that's really important is the relapse prevention. To demonstrate how the brain takes, and for me, I know I talk about this too, at least a year, if not a couple of years, for that brain fog to be removed, for the frontal lobe to be healed, which is in control of our decision making and problem solving skills. Because I can look back and think about some of the bad decisions I made in early recovery related to that. I mean, I can see now it was crazy. I had this huge,
Definitely.
yeah. So that chapter is important, and then it approaches the rest of the book. Is this again is my social work way? It talks about assessment, defining where your relationship is. Then we talk about tools, some specific things you can do. It addresses typical crises, how to handle situations that are really beyond your control. And I have a whole chapter dedicated to how to make a proper amends. And I again, my opinion on amends is not always very favorable to everyone and I talked with my sponsor about this on Monday. I met with her in person and was telling her about that. She and I are like old school 12 steppers. And her being a teacher, she gave me very clear definitions of what I was supposed to do with my 8th and 9th steps. So I parrot a lot of that and add my own opinion to it too. So because, you know, you can always expand on what's good and make it better. But I don't know if that's always going to be as favorable in the rooms because I take a pretty in-depth look at it. So the book is
Sorry, Janice. I'm
yeah.
intrigued to know, just maybe in a shorter sentence, maybe. But what is your view on amends? What's a proper amends for you? Because I'm intrigued actually, because I feel like we might be on the same page, and I'm guessing, but far away.
So I think, and I address the difference, and I even posted about this, the difference between an apology and an amends. An amends is much more in depth than an apology. You acknowledge you're part of the problem. You listen to the person's response. And the most important part is you tell them. So it's not just saying, I'm sorry. It's saying, I'm sorry that I did this to you. I hear that you're saying this is how you were impacted with it. And here's what I plan to do in the future. Here's how I hope to resolve that. Whether it's a simple thing like you stole $50 from your dad or something more like you had an affair on your spouse. Here are the steps I'm going to take. I think that is the key point. It's in depth and you address their feelings and offer an action step to what your side of it. How do you describe an amends? How do you see?
Yeah, do you know what, Janice? You've kind of hit the nail on the head. I was told basically what you've said. I was told this by my sponsor some 18 and a half years ago. And, he said that you sit there and you listen and you take what they have to say. And there was an amends I made and with an ex-partner that I hadn't seen for 7 years. And and she didn't live local. And I drove, I finally got hold of her, drove over to see her, and I was making my amends. And then she told me, two or three situations, maybe four, I can't remember how many, of things that I did in our relationship that I had no recollection of. And I sat there and listened. I sat there and listened, and how that impacted her life, her children's life, her extended family's life as well, because they all knew what had been going on or what I had done, etc. And you know, I come away from that with two things. One, she said to me, "Thank you for coming to make the amends," because she's lost a resentment with me, which was beautiful in itself. And that,
Yes.
but the second thing I come away with was that reaffirmed my step one, how powerless I was because I didn't even know I'd done them.
That's fabulous. Yeah. And I was asked
Yeah,
recently in a podcast whether or not a family member should bring things up, to their recovering family member in early sobriety, and hadn't really thought about it in depth. But the truth is yes. Yes, because it frees us.
mm,
One, it educates us, and then it frees us to know. I mean, I didn't
definitely.
yeah, especially if things happen during blackouts. There's things that we've done that we don't
Yeah,
remember, and yeah, it's a
yeah.
very healing process.
Yeah, and for me personally, blackout drinking was a daily thing for me. Blackout drinking, I don't know about yourself, but when you're in that state, as you say, you haven't got a clue, have you? You don't know what
Mm-mm.
you're doing or what you've done.
I didn't even realize that I had blackouts until after I got sober, because towards the end of my drinking, I was trying to cut back my drinking, but I was taking Ambien. So I learned later, because I was like, I've never had a blackout. I'm like, because you were so blacked out, you didn't remember they were in your home. And during those blackouts is when I get
Yeah, yeah,
brutal with my kids, verbally abusive, and
yeah,
yeah, that was one of the things I was afraid to
yeah,
do my amends with my children. I
yeah,
procrastinated. That was a big mistake I made. But because I was afraid, I knew I'd had blackouts by that point. I didn't really want to hear. I thought that I didn't want to hear what I'd done. But when I heard it, it wasn't as bad as I had imagined. Does that make sense? It
yeah. Mhm.
wasn't as
Yeah, it does
painful.
make sense. Yeah, and do you know what? When you do hear it as well, it's massive part of acceptance and accepting that you're an addict. The longer you push that away, that you don't want to hear these things. You know, I suppose it's bring it on is what I'm saying. If you want to
Mhm.
recover, you need to know what's going on. You want to be the best version of yourself and have a spiritual awakening. Then let everybody tell me what I've done. I want to hear it. And you got to be careful, though, as you say, because you know you need the right support network. You need a sponsor if you're in the fellowships. You need the program. You've got to work the program, because if you've got all this information coming at you and you've got nothing to numb the pain, then sitting there alone with it is a dangerous place to be.
Absolutely. That's why we need a sponsor. At my home group here
Yeah.
in Daphne, the beginning of every meeting, they make a point of saying, if you don't have a sponsor, you need one. Everyone who's willing to be a sponsor, raise your hand. You got no excuse now.
Yeah,
Grab
yeah.
someone before you leave the room, because you need
Yeah.
that. And that's an important
Yeah,
part
it's
of
beautiful.
our recovery in working with the family stuff, is that it's some of the stuff they tell you is going to hurt. Yeah. And you don't want to be triggered to
Yeah.
drink.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. How, as a social worker, how's your mindset changed in your job in that role from when before you got sober?
That's a
That's
great
intriguing
question.
me, actually.
Well, towards later in my career too, actually, my once I got married and started having children, I didn't work in the addiction fields. I worked more with crisis-oriented family social service settings and doing some medical social work. And so, yeah, so it has changed, definitely has changed. If I were to go back to addictions, I would have a whole new approach. I would be much more proactive.
Yeah.
Since COVID, during COVID, I got laid off. And after COVID, I essentially retired from social work, primarily to work on the book and to do more, because I think, especially like with these podcasts, you can reach more people than my speaking at the local
Yeah, yeah.
meetings. And even at going, because I've spoken at a number of conferences, and I think the podcast is a great opportunity to spread the information. So that's what I focused on since COVID is the book, reaching out to people.
Okay.
I have a fun part-time job that I still do, which, is fun and gives me on the days where I'm
Yeah,
like, I don't
yeah.
want to write, I don't want to research. I still feel productive because I'm still going to somewhere. Oh,
Janice, right? We're going to finish up shortly,
mhm.
uh, but I was going to ask you. Sorry, if you're going to ask me a question, fire away.
I also I would like to learn more about your charity, and, I meant to ask that
Okay.
earlier. I'm sorry. Maybe that would be another podcast segment for you, just to share a whole hour about the charity work that you're doing.
Yeah. Do you know what? That's a very valid point. It could be, and that's had its struggles in getting off the ground, really, and that's due to bureaucracy and everything else that goes
Mhm,
on. It's quite ironic. You try to do things for the greater good, and you come up with so many obstacles. But yeah, I think that is a good hour by itself, if I'm honest
mhm,
with you. But at the end of the day, it's there for. It's the same as what you just said a minute ago about podcasts. I've looked at this over the last 2 months, and I think, yeah, you can hit a lot of people throughout the world. I'm talking to you, and you're in Alabama. I'm
mhm,
in the UK. I was speaking to someone the other day who was in Bali. I'm talking to someone next week who's in South Africa, I think it is. And then, when you're building your audiences up, you can reach out to a lot of people. So I do think it's the way forward. And that was the reason behind the charity as well, because not everybody ends up in a fellowship meeting, and not
mhm,
everyone in the UK has got funds to get to a treatment centre. And this is the issue. So especially the younger generation, they don't tend to want to go into an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. I
mhm.
very rarely see young people in the meetings, but I'm telling you, they need it.
I totally agree. And one thing I like to say too is that I acknowledge that 12-step meetings are not the only way to get sober. AA, that there's other ways to get sober too. It is what worked for me, and so that's why I fall back on that a lot, but I'm not discounting other forms of treatment.
Yeah, I agree. Do you know what? I think back in my earlier recovery, I probably would have discounted any other forms of recovery programs, and even up until maybe 3, 4 years ago. But I've got people coming on the podcast who have got weird and wonderful ways how they've got sober, and I'm intrigued to find out how that's worked for them because. For me, I know I needed a rigorous program of soul searching and continuing looking at my
Mhm.
defects and my mindset, etc., on a daily basis, or I can be off the wall. So I kind of need that. I need that program because I've been really unwell in mentally unwell in sobriety for a fairly long period, And it's funny when I look back now, I see how unwell I was, and lo and behold, it's because I wasn't working any program in recovery.
Mhm.
That was the reason.
Yeah, yeah, and it's funny because at my job yesterday, I was leaving work and I was saying something, and one of my coworkers is like, "I can't believe you're still that actively involved in the program." And I'm like, "Can you imagine me if I weren't?" Like, you have your moments at work where you're cranking
Yeah.
me, and I'm like, "I need that program. I need that." It has evolved, but I still need you know, to work on myself daily.
I would like you, if you don't mind, I want to ask you one last question, and I
Mhm.
want this to be to our viewers and our listeners that if you can give them some advice, and you've given plenty of advice to be fair today, but on the last snippet of advice to anyone new to recovery, to give them some sort of hope, what would it be?
Well, it's just that sense. There is always hope. It took me 4 years to gain some level of respect and trust from my youngest child, and, I had to remain hopeful. I had to believe that if I continued just to do the next right step, we would get there, you know? I guess the other thing too is that, life is gonna continue to happen. Issues come up.
Yeah.
I continue to learn about stupid things I did when I was drinking, and the important part of that is to stop, acknowledge, and make a quick amends for those things. So it's not
Yeah,
a
beautiful.
finish line. There's no finish line.
There's no finish line. It's an ongoing process, one day at a time, isn't it? But it can be a beautiful life.
Hmm. It really is. I mean, I say this all the time when
Yeah.
we have a first step meeting that, you know, 11 years ago, I would never have imagined my life today. It so far exceeds, and my relationships with my kids is so much better than I could have ever dreamt of, you know?
Janice, listen, thank you. I want to say thank you so much. I genuinely loved talking. I could sit here all day and talk to you, but I'm more concerned of the batteries in my cameras are not going to last the distance. But do you know what it is? I feel like we need to do this again on a topic as well. Um,
Yes.
but I'm going to wish you all the luck for your book as well, and I mean that because I'm writing one myself, and I know how tricky it is and how exciting it is, and all them things as well. So I wish you all the luck with that, and your
Thank you.
children, and your journey of a. And do you know what? I want to thank you again as well for being so supportive to the Sober Stew podcast. Genuinely mean that.
Well, and I generally believe you have a great message. You're a great speaker, and I love your content on Instagram. I think this podcast is going to be really successful. So I'm excited to be in your first season.
Bless you.